Hello everyone, today we talk about the 206 BC Battle of Ilipa with the famous Scipio that had yet to become Africanus Publius Cornelius Scipio, the greatest general in Roman history indeed, and against the Carthaginian commander Asdrubal, son of Jesco. And this is probably one of the most important battles in Roman history, especially for the history of the tactical history of the Roman legion. Even though it's not extremely well known in popular culture, you rarely read or see much around, as far as I'm concerned, at least. And instead, it is, as we will see, probably one of the most important clashes for the story, especially of the Manipular Legion and how it evolved tactically over time. So we're not gonna give a great strategic context in here, because the video will be about the battle that is enough complex and rich in informations the way it is. However, we are essentially in today's southern Spain, in Andalusia. Actually, Ilipa, I've read it should be a place that it is in today's suburbs of Seville. So we are at the point in the Spanish campaign of Scipio, into which the Carthaginians had been basically knocked almost out of the peninsula, and this battle actually would mark the end of their resistance in the Iberian soil. In fact, Scipio would decide, essentially after the victory at Ilipa, to bring the war into Africa itself, and therefore to fight against the Carthaginians on their own soil. As you can see, essentially Scipio had kicked the Carthaginians pushing westwards, and at this point the Carthaginians had enough forces to be drawn to form a very large army that, according to the sources, that claim 50,000, between 50 and 70,000 troops from the Carthaginian side that were recruited mostly from the western Iberia at this point. The numbers are a bit inflated, we believe, because managing 70,000 soldiers in any theater, it's something extremely complicated. The armies of those times couldn't reach up to that number. So the other the only plausible figure is actually the minimal one that is given to 50,000, which is already a huge army, as a matter of fact. So we can even say that the Carthaginians were less troops. We don't have clear knowledge about concretely how much of the single armies were made up. We know that both in the Carthaginian and in the Roman army there was a pretty consistent number of Iberian allies that both contendants had risen from their respective domains in Spain at that point. But what I mean is that we don't have the actual sum of the individual contingent to calculate a broad number, unfortunately. The same goes for the Romans. The Romans at this point had quite of a seasoned army of veterans in Spain that had been fighting this perfect strategic strategically led campaign at this point. The Second Punic War is an amazing war. If you want to study any war in history and you have to pick only one, please study the Second Punic War. The campaign that Scipio had carried out in Spain is practically a perfect campaign, and it would be also at Ilipa. but for saying that the Roman legionnaires, Roman and Italic allies, and were quite an experienced force, and keep this in mind because we will see eventually how this eventually influenced the same tactics that Scipio enacted during the battle. And the Romans could be something actually even superior to the Carthaginian in numbers. We can name something like 45,000 is a very large number also in here, and some 3,000 cavalry. The Carthaginians had, in addition to the 50,000, some 4,500 cavalry. And the Carthaginians having also 32 elephants at least. Now all these numbers can be obviously reduced for the sake of historical plausibility, we can say, but they were still very consistent numbers, and perhaps the Romans were even superior to the Carthaginians in numbers. But these numbers, as I was saying before, were strongly inflated by the actually the amount of Iberian levies that had been taken from both sides to make mass. Essentially, the Carthaginians could hire these troops, and they had done in order to push eastwards towards Scipio's army. And when Scipio had acknowledged the number of the Carthaginians, he had sent his officers to recruit as many Iberians as possible in order to make a similar to reach up the same numbers. We said that the Romans therefore had this core of very skilled, very experienced legionnaires, and a body of Iberians. The Carthaginian backbone was made up by the African and Carthaginian infantry, the so-called Lybio-Pheonicians, that were essentially the infantry backbone also of Hannibal's army. Hannibal now was retreating essentially to Africa, and he would meet Scipio with his Italian veterans into Africa itself. But the Carthaginians had brought Lybio-Phoenician infantry also in Iberia, and now they were fighting with this force. So there were obviously differences between the Lybio-Phoenicians and the Roman legionnaires in terms of the warfare that they carried out, but they were pretty consistent infantrymen, pretty consistent infantry force, also qualitatively speaking. So we don't have any other clear number of, at least I wasn't able to collect. You have to think that the sources we are relying on are very few, which is for anyone who studies ancient history, it's kind of, from one side it's kind of boring because there is not much more room for research, and unless something archaeological doesn't pop out magically, let's say. But at the same time, it's relatively easy to reconstruct these battles if you have the tools to do, because even reading in translation, it's not a great thing relatively to the sources. You must have a certain general background on ancient warfare to understand these things, but overall you have just like two sources. Today I will be essentially there is Polybius and Livy at this point for this battle, and Livy is also following Polybius, so they're basically saying the same things. So you don't have to be surprised that we have such a general and scanty amount of information relatively to these armies. We know, however, fairly well, what these armies were the product of in terms of the respective military traditions of the Romans and of the Carthaginians. And also this Iberian element is interesting because it tells you how both the Romans and the Carthaginians at this point were essentially a fully Hellenized they had a fully Hellenized military system. Now, being Hellenized doesn't mean to speak Greek or wearing, a Greek armor. It means essentially having followed the Hellenistic tradition of combined arms. And during the Second Punic War and before, relatively with Hannibal, you have even the the announcement of this with essentially the Battle of Cannae is the peak of military development. There are certain military historians that say, from Cannae nothing has been basically added anymore to the art of war, and this is true because what Hannibal and consequently the Carthaginian army had managed to do there was to surpass the Hellenistic concept of hammer and anvil as the Macedonians had basically created it, and to conceive the elements that you have in your the tools that you have in terms of your military forces and the terrain and all as a big picture that you have to use in all its form, in all its potential, in order to achieve an ultimate goal. And this can happen only, however, if you have troops that are enough skilled, enough trained to perform certain maneuvers, because this is obviously what always remains at the core of warfare in every age. The skill, the training of the individual the collective training of the military the units that you have, and their ability of carrying out certain maneuvers, and therefore essentially creating that picture that is in the commander's mind. And the Romans at this point fighting with against Hannibal, in the person of people like of military commanders like Claudius Nero and especially Publius Cornelius Scipio, had begun to learn from these tactics and to replicate them against the Carthaginians at this point. And the battles like Ilipa, as we will see, were essentially the ones into which Scipio managed to fully develop the tactical potential of the manipular legion, making it carrying out certain maneuvers that, contrarily-wise to what is commonly thought, the manipular legion was not at all capable of performing, because the manipular legion was flexible at a point compared to the previous Roman armies and to others of the times. But it's not until the Second Punic War that, for instance, they would be able to make to wheel to surround the enemy if not accidentally. So this was possible only because of the degree of professionalism and military experience that Scipio's veterans had obtained during the Annibalic War. So let's simply go at this point towards the battle in itself. So there is a bit of previous movements to the battle. Essentially, Scipio arrived into this at Ilipa and began to build up camp, set up the camp, and he prepared a trick for the Carthaginians, who, by basically making them believe that those who were building up the camp were without any defense. So the Carthaginian cavalry of Asdrubal attacked the Roman soldiers that were working at the camp, but Scipio had concealed the force of cavalry in his turn, and at the right moment he made it attack, and he caught the enemy cavalry by surprise. Other troops, other Roman troops took up arms and attacked the cavalry, counterattacked the cavalry in turn. So the cavalry was broken, and the Romans won this clash. This seemingly, from sources, leaves the note that rose the Roman morale and kind of lowered the one of the Carthaginians. So at this point, the two armies were essentially encamped, one in front of the other, and there would be some indecisive skirmishing taking place for some days. At one point, the Carthaginians began to basically form to draw up for battle. At a very late hour, we know probably in the afternoon, or even in the early evening. But normally these armies didn't fight at night, so probably it was the afternoon. But I mean late for what normally the time that normally these battles started, usually in the morning, because they were very long engagements at some point. So Asdrubal drew up his army out of his camp, and deploying as you can see here in the map, with the African infantry in the center, and the Iberian infantry on the flanks. This would be a normal. I mean, the infantry at this point was the main force of not just in the Carthaginian or Roman armies, but just in the ancient warfare. So the main body of the army was crucially represented by these infantry, and it would be normal to have a strong center with Lybio-Pheonician infantry at this from the side of Hasdrubal, and the less reliable Spaniards on the flanks. You know, the difference essentially being that while the Lybio-Pheonicians weren't probably kept in an extremely different fashion than the Iberian troops, even if they had their own particular military traditions and favorite weapons that were, by the way, very difficult to detach them to leave. There is sometimes you find that the Carthaginians fighting in the campaign of Italy kind of began to fight like Roman legionnaires. This is absolutely false. I mean, surely some of them used Roman gear that they captured, and we know it fairly well, at least the first lines being equipped in that fashion, because Livy tells us that at a point there wasn't much of a difference between the first line of the Romans and the first line of the Carthaginians in sight, but it's very likely that the majority of the Lybio-Phoenicians kept fighting with their own peculiar weapons. There were shield and the so-called long K. It was a sort of it was a heavy javelin that could be used both as a spear and as a throwing weapon, and that had been pretty effective against even the Roman legionnaires. But the main difference with the Iberians being that while the Lybio-Phoenicians had been solidly trained by the Carthaginians in discipline and in collective formations, the Iberians were just tribal levies that were raised and fighting under their own chiefs and not having really a collective training and cohesion, and therefore they were better on the flanks at this point. And Hasdrubal reinforced these flanks, by the way, with by placing the elephants in front of them. I mean, that's also a pretty good indicator that the elephants were normally something difficultly to attack from the front, because you surely wouldn't like to be charged by them. So having placed them in front of a less reliable infantry kind of made sense, and probably the general idea was that the elephants could at a certain point charge and make a mess into the Roman lines, and eventually to let these less reliable Iberians to charge in an already disordered formation, and therefore put at in practice at that point not their collective training, but rather their individual one that was at least acceptable on a disordered formation. So there were also skirmishers. Naturally, you have to think a normal element of ancient warfare, even if not really decisive, being this kind of extremely light infantry, like running back and forth among the lines and skirmishing and kind of trying to soften up, or like texting the enemy in its the enemy ranks in their solidity and cohesion, a bit like that. But they're less important units in this sense. And what would happen, as the sources tell us, is that for 3 days the Carthaginian the same thing happened. In a completely identical way. I mean, every day at a late hour, the Carthaginians would come out of their camp, they would draw in battle line, and they would ask the Romans to fight, essentially. The Romans would do the same thing, but really not attacking one the other. So this is interesting because we don't really know what the real plans originally were. As we will see, Scipio probably, in my opinion, kind of insisted a bit on this in order to eventually make a successful trick to Asdrubal. But we can't see, especially considering the quantity of the troops involved in the clash, that risking battle by attacking first was indeed probably not a wise option at that point. You know that he who attacks has always a less and the more the attack progresses, and the more its cohesion tends to get lost. So who is in defense is always advantaged in this sense. We have seen how the Roman and Carthaginian army were pretty much equal in their numbers, and probably roughly also in quality, even if the Romans definitely eventually made the difference. But I mean, meeting especially with that array was a bit risky. The Romans, by the way, were deployed for all 3 days, just like the Carthaginians, in the same way, with the Roman infantry in the center. So just like the Carthaginians deploying the best their troops in the center as a reliable force, and the Iberians on the flanks, exactly in the same fashion. So this situation, as we were saying, went on for 3 days. Every time deploying, every time eventually retreating in the evening to their respective camps, and it seemed as if this was going on forever. You have to think that this is not a video game. I mean, there are certain costs that derive from protracting your presence on, especially on the same battlefield, on the same camp for more days. You have to think of all the the attrition that is playing here, all the moral forces that definitely do not benefit from a prolonged wait. So these are not things that you can go on forever with, and you need essentially to break up the situation. But Scipio was a military genius indeed. As we said, the greatest Roman commander in history renownedly, by the way. I know that there are many kind of lists. Who was the best commander? And then people who know just Caesar say, oh, well, obviously it's Caesar, because yeah, Caesar. No, the greatest military commander in Roman history is renownedly Publius Cornelius Scipio, later nicknamed Africanus because of his victory over the Carthaginians in Africa. So he obtained, after the triumph, in the sense as it was normal for Roman commanders, he, today we're just seeing a tiny bit of his genius, but as I was saying before, study the Second Punic War and see what Scipio did, not just as a military man, but also as a politician, as a diplomat, if you want to, as an administrator. I mean, he was kind of an outstanding figure. As much as Hannibal. I mean, it's very tough to say who was best. I leave this to you, frankly, because I don't want to assume myself the responsibility of answering this. Maybe one day we'll have the foolishness of doing so. But for now, what Scipio thought was something extremely clever. Basically, during one evening, he ordered his men to prepare before the next dawn, to be armed and properly fed. This is very important in history. You have to, in military history, you have to think that eating is something. I mean, in order to sustain a prolonged fight, you need to be well rested, to be well fed, so to have the energies, the sheer energies to exist for hours with a full gear on under the sun, and with all the fear and the anxiety that you already have, probably. And the men seemingly, the Roman veterans at this point loved, obviously, their commander. They understood of which paste he was made of, and they immediately understood that there was something on, so that they would come to battle soon, because that's evident why such an order otherwise. So at the first light, Scipio sent cavalry and light infantry to harry the Carthaginian camp. Now, this was the cavalry and light infantry are mobile troops, so there were troops who are very flexible, that are perfect to harass the enemy, to skirmish, to make a bit of mess also, in this sense, and who, however, cannot have this prolonged. They can't fight into melee in practice, because cavalry, unless it doesn't charge and from the rear or the flanks, it's not pretty useful against infantry in this stage, into this phase of military history. And the skirmishers also can provoke the enemy, but not really solving the situation. Now, this seemingly caught Hasdrubal by surprise, because the Romans at this point were really attacking at the Carthaginian palisades, and all the Carthaginian army was in disarray, because they had been used, and here you might start to understand what Scipio's plans were, to fight later in the day. So they were probably woken up early while they were still sleeping. They were not ordered to line out, to come out of the camp and draw once again in front of the Romans. The whole thing causing a bit of chaos among the Carthaginian, and agitation especially, because the Romans, as we were saying, weren't much of a problem at this point with just cavalry and skirmishers, but even as I was saying before, even the anxiety, the apprehension for sudden bad surprises that could happen could make an amplified effect on the enemy, on the Carthaginian morale. And one of the while this was going on, Scipio was actually deploying the rest of his troops. This is interesting because from the sources we get that the Carthaginians were actually seeing the Roman standards out there, and understanding that the legionaries were lining up for battle. But at the same time, we have to think that these skirmishers and Roman skirmishers and cavalry were making enough confusion and even arising enough dust, probably, not to make everything entirely clear. And even from a visual point of view, you have to understand that there were ways, in this sense, to conceal the site of the battlefield, and even moving several hundred men would cause this cloud of dust that could even not render very clear what was happening in beyond that. And Scipio, in fact, was preparing a nasty surprise for the Carthaginians at this point, because he basically switched formation. He didn't deploy the Romans in the center like he had been doing in the previous days, but on the contrary, he deployed his legionaries on the two wings. Here I the picture shows it. So very simple change. The rest of the formation, as much as we know, remained the same, while the Iberians, in place of the Roman legionaries, were deployed in the center. Now you will say, but yeah, we were talking about the reliability of the very center of the of the army. So what was the point of putting the Iberians in the center? Just wait. At the same time, the Carthaginians were so kind of messed up at this point that that Hasdrubal mobilized his whole forces without even having them breakfasted. So they were probably tired, agitated, not well fed, so this was a substantial disadvantage, considering that the Romans instead already knew that this would go on, so they were well rested, breakfasted, and also high in morale, evidently. And he came out of the camp with his army and drew up his men in the usual formation, so with the Carthaginians in the center and the Iberians on the wings. So the skirmishing was going on, in the sense that when you draw up your army, you're probably one of the most dangerous moments because essentially you have all these men that are still not properly ordered. So they're not effective as combat units yet. At least they can fight as individuals, but they don't have that advantage deriving from a fully ordered formation. So the whole thing was even going probably was processing relatively slow, considering that the Roman skirmishers and cavalry were continuing to harass the Carthaginians, and obviously there were Carthaginian skirmishers and cavalry that were kind of clashing with the Romans, but this even increased the confusion, even increased the amount of dust in the air. So Hasdrubal had not noticed, evidently, that Scipio had drawn up his men with a different deployment that would create really problems to Hasdrubal. So at this point the skirmishing ceased, because seemingly when it was even almost noon, Scipio retreated, pulled back his skirmishers. By the way, you have to imagine even the Carthaginians being already tired of staying out there in that situation, being hungry, staying under the sun. The Battle of Ilipa took place in spring, and I've never been in southern Spain, but I can assure you that that's a pretty hot place to stay, even in the spring. So we know seemingly this was a sunny day. At least the sources talk explicitly about the sun hitting the enemy, the soldiers alike, obviously, because the Romans didn't have umbrellas protecting them, or at least they had the resources. They had been enough fed to have the strength to suffer that for a longer time. Now, at this point, the action between the two armies really starts, because Scipio makes the first move. So the Carthaginians at this time were deployed. The Roman skirmishers came back to the Roman army. By the way, we know that in order to practically take his skirmishers back, Scipio made the ranks of his army enlarging and making these skirmishers passing into the gaps back to the side of the army, so to the rear of the army, and using them eventually again, as we will see during the battle itself. Figured these skirmishers, by the way, very skirmishers are normally good runners and specialize in hit and run tactics. So that's something they were probably used to. Energetic, elastic, we can't say young man, trained to do that, but still, it had been a considerable effort up to that point already, and they instead had an important role even in the following events of the battle. And once everything was perfectly set up, Scipio gave the order for advance. Now, probably all the outcome of the battle was decided into this phase of advancement, not even in the fight proper, because Scipio was at this time on his right wing, so with the Romans of the right wing. We said, recall it, center made up of Iberians, two flanks made of Roman or Italic legionnaires. However, they were pretty much the same. They were pretty homogeneous at this time, and especially after all the campaign, they were a pretty homogeneous force. What he ordered was the following: the Iberians had to advance slowly. The idea was that they didn't even have to arrive to the to whom they had in the front, that is the Lybio-Pheonician infantry, while he ordered the Roman wings to march straight at the enemy at a normal pace, if I'm not wrong, not an accelerated one, but faster than the Iberians, which was something even probably not so difficult to achieve, in the sense that the Iberians at that point were already the only way for them to keep the formation was to march slowly, because they weren't so disciplined and well ordered. So probably even the usual abilities of these respective units were enough to achieve that, but it was an explicit order. So what Scipio did at this point, and this is one of the most amazing maneuvers that the Romans ever carried out with a manipular legion, was to transform these units of Roman troops. Here you see into the picture how the Roman wings were at the beginning of the battle with a front towards the enemy. What they did was to turn in their respective flanks, the right wing on the right and the left wing on the left, therefore changing their front and proceeding in this way as a column. So what was the front line after having turned would become the flank of the unit. And this was carried out, and I'm reading Polybius in here, by using cohorts. Now this is something you find in the Roman sources. Polybius was writing in Greek because he was a Greek, by the way, and if I'm not wrong, the term he uses in Greek is semaya, while Livius was using cohortes, but that's essentially more or less the same term, at least in this context it should be the same. Now the problem is that we don't really know what a cohort during the Second Punic War was. Now some of you will come out, but it was Marius who invented the cohorts. No, sorry, one day I will explain this. Marius really just formalized the cohortal system as it was already being in use at this point, as far as we know, even as early as during the Second Punic War, because in these sources, during the Spanish campaign of Scipio, you have the explicitation of this in the sources. Here it says and what was the cohort made of? It was made up of 3 maniples plus the usual number of velites. So these guys would be normally what it became essentially the equivalent even in the Marian legion. I mean, the cohort being essentially made up of 3 maniples, that remained really even into the cohortal system, at least from even an administrative point of view, with the names of the original Astati, Principes, and Triarii, so etc. But what is important here is that we have it already in 206 BC. I mean, the cohort was there. And what he did with these cohorts, here's Polybius explaining, he turned the one to the left, turned the one to the left, the other to the right, and advanced at great speed in column upon the enemy. So basically, what it did is to make these formations turn and transforming them into their flank into the front in an order of march, and it marched with these Roman infantry together with the velites. So as we have seen, together with the infantry and with the turmae that were the Roman cavalry units together with them. So basically these 2 Roman wings, as you see here in the picture, it's a bit this is a bit schematic, and you find velites placed in front of the whole body or in the cavalry just ahead, but we don't really know how they advanced at this point. The important is that as bodies of Roman troops, they marched far ahead the Iberians and reached up to the extremes of the Carthaginian battle line, respectively on the right, the Roman right wing on the left extreme of the Carthaginian line, and the left Roman wing on the right of the extreme right of the Carthaginian line. So the evident intent at this point was the one of flanking the enemy, of trying essentially to attack the Iberian wings at this point, and with the elephants and the cavalry, with the Roman troops, and leaving the Iberians behind, which is what was achieved. And very interestingly, wait a second. What I wanted to conclude. The Iberians were really at this point not even meant to attack the Lybio-Phoenician center, because the idea was essentially to leave them as a deterrent force to paralyze the Lybio-Phoenician infantry, in order to leave it still idling while the Iberian flanks were devoured literally by the Romans. And this would be evident because if the Lybio-Phoenicians had wanted to attack one, or to give aid to one of the two Iberian flanks, they had unavoidably to expose their own flank in turn to the Iberian contingent of the Roman army. So, and this was extremely clever, because the Roman infantry was able to perform this incredible maneuver that had never been carried out before, and which was one of the most difficult ones, because these guys had to march perfectly, keeping the order and wheeling at the same time with an order that had to be functional eventually to meet up the enemy into melee. Reason for which, when the Romans reached the extremes of the Carthaginian line, they in turn passed once again from column formation to you can say battle formation. So they basically turned once again their side towards toward the Iberian infantry and engaged them. At this point, the situation was quite serious for the Iberians, because the Iberians weren't as good in combat as the Roman legionnaires. They didn't have the same training, they didn't have the same cohesion. The Romans were easily butchering them down. And in the meanwhile, you remember the elephants, right? That were in that place. The elephants were being harassed by the Roman velites. The velites, I didn't explain it, but are essentially the Roman skirmishers, the Roman levies that are meant to skirmish the enemy, and not really fighting in a rank like the other legionnaires, but essentially being scattered and hitting the enemy with javelins. So that the poor elephants were being hit heavily by all sides, by the Roman javelins, and also by Roman cavalry that attacked also the elephants and the rest of the Carthaginian cavalry that was there. By the way, the only way to kill an elephant is even to this is pretty sad and and weird at the same time. That the only way to effectively hit an elephant in those times with those the weapons of the time, was hitting him in the backside, because it was the only soft place, because the rest of the animal being covered with thick and kind of coriaceous skin. This is actually pretty sad. I'm always sad when horses or elephants died in these battles, but obviously I feel the dramatic side also for the men that were really butchering them down. This kind of warfare was really very very crude and very low butchery, really, baths of blood, in the real sense of the word. But you have to imagine most of all the confusion. The Carthaginians were already tired. They didn't expect the Romans to ever do such to first of all to deploy in a different way from the one of the previous days, but absolutely they had never seen Romans performing that maneuver of these two wings being able to wheel and keep in formation, and even to eventually return into from passing once again from column to battle formation and to attack formation and to engage with with their wings. This was taking place on both wings. So as we said, the Lybio-Phoenician center couldn't do anything, and they didn't dare to do anything to save the one or two of the flanks, because they would have been attacked by the Iberian allies of the Romans in turn. So quite soon the Carthaginian armies began, especially the Carthaginian wings, began to rout. Initially, really, kind of an ordered way. You have to think that routes didn't take. They weren't sudden. It started with a few men first, then all the panic spreading, and then the mass fleeing taking place. And the Romans, by the way, on the flanks with the cavalry and the velites, were kind of even managing to even outflank the Carthaginian army. So the Iberians actually fought well, initially speaking, but they couldn't do much against the legionnaires, and so they fled. Even the elephants, seemingly they were wounded and in pain and really out of control, began to hit the same Iberians and Carthaginians, and causing a serious disorder. So the world situation basically collapsed, and telling the truth, the Lybio-Phoenicians actually stood in the center. They didn't flee like the Iberians were doing. You have to understand this as as a product of the situation. We don't really know how this whole thing went on, but there is even a sense of esprit de corps and of pride that you don't want to really flee at a certain point, even if the situation is desperate. But in this sense, the Lybio-Phoenicians were quite lucky, because there was a sudden and very violent rainstorm taking place. So this caused a great problem even with the terrain. The Romans had troubles eventually to come back to their own camp. So Asdrubal retreated endly with his Lybio-Phoenicians and into the camp, and together with the Iberians who had managed to escape. And he decided, by the way, to keep fighting. I mean, Romans were the battle was won by the Romans, but the Romans hadn't had at this point, because of the rain, the possibility of finishing the enemy off. But the Carthaginian army was extremely weak, and the Iberian chieftains at a certain point began even to desert the Carthaginians. So Asdrubal initially wanted to resist and to make a last stand in his camp, but during the night he basically slipped away as well, and the Romans were in this sense, in terms of ground control, the undisputed victors of this battle. Now, what it is interesting, and so this is in a nutshell essentially the battle of Ilipa. And what it is, however, the most important thing I would like to leave you with is the maneuver on the wings by the Roman legionnaires. I want to really stress the importance of this maneuver because the Maniples had never been able to achieve anything like that. The reason why they did is that these guys had basically been a professional force at this point. The Roman army being up to the Punic War essentially a militia that was fielded for a relatively brief amount of time. This thing had been a bit changed over time because it was obvious that since even major engagements, even previous to the Punic Wars, that there were certain legionnaires that were making a living out of this military business, this military service, in the sense that the Roman society was slowly changing. You know, the ideal of the peasant soldier who could equip himself and just go to war when the city called. I mean, it was a very romantic thing that probably wasn't out there, not even before the Second Punic War. But the Second Punic War was this major involvement that brought the Italians, I mean the Roman legions out of Italy for very long times. Think about these veterans of Scipio, indeed, who in this sense had a military experience, a prolonged military experience that obviously gave them more collective training, esprit de corps, and overall a better cohesion and discipline. And it is no surprise that it's only at this point that Romans began to realize, and the Roman commanders began to rely so much on the quality of their men to make them successfully achieve such complex maneuvers that require really a lot of quality of the troops. And obviously we have to understand to thank even in this sense the genius of Scipio, because he was the one who we can't say first, because at the Metaurus River the consul Claudius Nero actually achieved something very similar, but at this point Scipio developed this tactics and was essentially testing it in its effectiveness, and it is the one that eventually he brought to he used into Africa when fighting continuing to fight against the Carthaginians and eventually against Hannibal himself. And up to this point the Romans didn't really do anything, hadn't done anything like that. It was something extremely experimental. You have to think that, you know, today to us it's as if it was something to that had just to be discovered. No, there is no teleology into this. There is no necessity into this. I mean, if Scipio had not been such a military genius, he would have not managed to carry out these tactics, because they were extremely risky. Nobody had ever done them before. We know from this battle that indeed both sides were fighting for their own survival, essentially, because if the Romans had lost, the whole situation would have been pretty dear for them. They would have been slaughtered and massacred. So they were really trying something new, not knowing whether it would work or not, but it worked, and it worked thanks to the military genius of Scipio and the military experience of his legionnaires. And there is even this bond between commander and troops that is something very important. You know, you have to trust someone who is telling you to go risk your life for something that from which you might not come back if it goes wrong. So it requires a lot of collaboration in this sense. It requires a lot of trust, a lot of a lot of trust, even more than ability, because moral resources are something that really can evaporate quite quickly. So Finca, having tried this and having succeeded in doing so, both from the side of Scipio and from the side of his veterans, that at this point would have followed him really to the moon if the Romans could, and yeah, this is really what I want to say, and just adding that, and I will explain this in the future, one of my future videos about the Roman armies, that never think of the manipular system as something that was invented like that, like, you know, someone in the 4th century one day woke up and said, oh yeah, let's invent the manipular system, oh yeah, and everybody knew what he was talking about, yeah, right. The manipular system was something that took really ages, you know, at least almost 2 centuries to become to what you can see at Ilipa. And before Ilipa, just at the Metaurus River, we see the maniples actually being able to wheel on march and to redeploy into a battle formation, ready to meet the enemy, to attack the enemy. And before, in the manipular system, you don't find that. So just for saying to those who believe into these modernistic and functionalistic ideas that, you know, a military system is born as if, you know, it's born all done, all perfect, all without practice, without experience, without nothing, just know that the manipular system was not at all this extremely maneuverable and flexible system that people like to stress, because when it was created, it was not. The best thing you could do with it was essentially switching ranks, but always with the idea that it was a frontal attack. I mean, the idea of a maniple, in this sense, detaching from the main body and making a maneuver for flanking the enemy, had never been seen before this, literally. So the idea of the maniple, in this sense, it was that you could swap the lines, and therefore making fresh bodies of troops meeting the enemy when the first lines were too exhausted. And this is also something very ideal, in the sense that you don't have the luxury of being capable of doing this all the time. We have even a very scanty evidence that this was practiced regularly, even in the manipular army in itself. The enemy is a force that can attack you repeatedly, and yes, between the pauses between fights you can switch, switch lines, but what you're gonna meet is still something extremely tough, that even if you switch lines, I mean, you probably can gain some advantage, but you're not gonna defeat the enemy just because of that. And the Second Punic War, in this sense, it's one of those wars that proves that how maneuvering is what really changes the situation. Here in the Battle of Ilipa, is it is the maneuver on the wings that really changes the thing, because until those the Carthaginians and Romans had drawn up every day in the same old fashion, they didn't even evidently want to meet each other, because they knew that it was like 50-50 at that point. And it's just by being obliged in a certain sense to unblock the situation that Scipio decided to carry out this maneuver. We don't know in his beautiful mind how much he thought about that, how much he expected to do that before the battle. We know, however, that he won carrying out this maneuver. And before this, in Roman history, we don't have anything like that. Just Claudius Nero on the Metaurus River doing a very complex maneuver, but not really quite the same, this being much more complicated. So always think in this sense that the Romans, before the Second Punic War, had a manipular system, had a manipular legion that was still framed into this idea of attacking frontally, and that nobody had ever ventured and could venture, given the quality of the Roman legionaries previously to the Second Punic War, to do something like what Scipio did at Ilipa, or Nero at the Metaurus River. This is extremely important. This is why the Battle of Ilipa is so interesting. After all, as we were saying, it is also famous because it was basically the last, the best battle into Spain. So Spain was over. It passed to the Romans, and the Carthaginians couldn't hit Italy from there anymore. Next stop, we can say Africa. So another time I will obviously talk about Zama, but just for saying that, and other battles that occurred that really can make better understand the importance of Ilipa in perspective, because if you read it now, it seems like, I don't know if you came here, if you have any, if you're familiar. I'm sure there are people now that are listening to me that already knew actually what a Battle of Ilipa was about, and that have an extensive knowledge about the Second Punic War or ancient warfare. But if you came here for the first time, like, and never having heard of this battle, it's obvious that if you don't stress this last point to you can learn about this maneuver, but it's more difficult to frame it into a picture relatively to the tactical evolution of the Roman army. So now I will conclude the video, but just for saying that in my Roman army playlist I will try eventually to add other videos that explain this passage that I find of excruciating importance. Another point before I go, I wanted to put in to emphasize is the role of the cohorts. Now, as I was saying before, the cohorts were these putting, in this case, three maniples together, basically moving into under as a whole body, with the same manipular difference within the ranks, surely, but conceiving this body as a whole as something more compact and more autonomous, tactically speaking, than the simple sum of the maniples. So this is very interesting being named by the sources, because it really means that it was out there. I mean, the concept of the cohort is something that was definitely put into practice as early as at this point. Polybius was writing from a time into which the cohort, in this sense, was still to be formalized by the Marian reform, but evidently he knew what he was talking about, and even Livy, in writing later, of course, and in a moment in which the cohorts were the norm in the Roman army, it's still very meaningful considering the whole military history that he makes of Rome in his history. He explicitly talks about cohorts in this context. So obviously we don't have to be over reliant on these sources, in the sense that nor Livy, nor even Polybius, contrarily wise to the normal Vulgata, were these expert about military things. You will say, how Polybius? Well, he was expert about that. He was even a military advisor. Yes, but this is also another bit of a myth that I will maybe explain in other circumstances. But let's say that he actually never saw much. First of all, he obviously didn't see what the events of the Second Punic War he was writing about, so it's still, we don't know what his sources were, unfortunately. But more than else, he actually didn't see much of actual warfare going on, especially of the Roman army, and even the Phalangite system that he discusses about, the famous chapter about the Manipular legion versus the Hellenistic, the Macedonian phalanx. It's something that he was really rationalizing from a positivistic perspective, but even from the way he writes about that, we can easily understand that he had never seen them fighting together. And this idea of the cohort is, why was it born at that point? Well, the idea is that if you are gonna, very roughly, because this is not some, these are actually very complicated topics to discuss. But the idea is that if you have a the maniple is something you have and you need as long as you have that frontal and kind of idling perspective that the Manipular legion was before these times. So essentially a body that was easier to use into battle. We don't really know how much into fight in actual terms, but that was easy to kind of to move when the swapping ranks maneuvers occurred. But the maniple in this sense is just a fraction of a longer line, of a longer rank that goes that makes up the front line and the first and second line behind that. But the cohort in this sense is something that works in depth. I mean, the cohort is not made up of maniples that are on the same line, but of maniples that are on the same file, we can say. So in depth. And this suggests one thing, that it's a much heftier formation. It's something that is meant really to more easily perform flanking operations, because you don't take a part of the line, you take a part of the whole army and as a block cut in depth and switch it somewhere else. In the Battle of Ilipa, what you see here is exactly this. I mean, the Roman contingents were even basically split in two wings, and these wings would wheel on their respective flanks and march as columns, as bodies on their own. So in this sense, the cohort is already functional as an autonomous unit from an organical point of view that can rotate, can wheel, and can work as a battle force on its own, which means basically to even go beyond the same concept of legion in many ways. And that reveals only at this point the very full flexibility and maneuverability of the legion, that however was in this sense to evolve towards a cohortal system and not towards a manipular one. I mean, the maniples, as we said, remained, but they were kind of smaller fractions. There were like 120 men originally, then even the number kind of floated. At one point they got bigger to 160. I mean, but even these numbers fluctuated in this sense, because no army is alike, but generally speaking, it's important to spot at this very early age the switch from the manipular system to the cohortal system already. I mean, even before the manipular system was formally abandoned, and for necessities that weren't administrative, but they were purely tactical. I mean, they were based on the actual need of performing certain tactics, certain maneuvers that were evidently necessary to unblock the situation, like we have seen into the case of Ilipa. Then, how things really worked, this is something a bit more complicated, in the sense that we know really too few. I mean, this is really all what we know in part. I'm explaining it badly, of course. By the way, in the sources to the Battle of Ilipa, for instance, I don't remember whether it was Polybius or Livy, but it says that when the Roman wings were engaging the Iberian flanks, and that they were meeting against the elephants. It says at one point that the elephants were being hit by the Roman skirmishers, the Roman cavalrymen, and then by the lightly armored. Now, who were these lightly armored? Evidently, they could be legionnaires as well, which is quite interesting because the sources mention that there were already the velites into the cohorts. So there would be these scattered guys, scattered skirmishers, and then the heavy Roman legionnaires, the heavy infantry essentially, if you want to name them as heavy. And the distinction between legionaries and those lightly equipped, light armored, I don't remember what's the term, suggests that there were actually even probably legionnaires that were equipped in light form. So this is really just speculation, because there might have been even, I don't know, other Iberian allies. By the way, the sources named the Roman turmae just for the cavalry, but we know that the Romans had even Iberian cavalry, so maybe these lightly equipped troops were maybe Iberian foot that were fighting together with Romans, maybe mixed up together with the velites, we don't know. But the fact that that distinction was made, maybe, I don't know, maybe it was just a literally invention. Maybe if it was Livy, I don't really remember. Maybe Livy is in this sense more of a but it's still meaningful, because we're not surprised by hearing that the Roman legionnaires could be more likely equipped. This is something we find in all times in the Roman army, legionnaires that could really get rid of momentarily of their heavy gear and attacking with a lighter equipment, especially as an assault force, and this could be the case because that's what we're doing on the Carthaginian flanks against the Iberians. But what is interesting is that they could operate in this sense into a cohortal system that was deriving from a manipular legion, and that in this sense wasn't made up evidently just of heavy infantry, but it still implied the cooperation of lighter armored, lightly equipped, how do you want to say, troops of legionnaires. At the same time, you will say, but at this point, if they were essentially retaining the manipular, segmentation of Astati, Principes, and Triari, why? It might have been that the lightly equipped were the Astati that were lightly equipped. I don't think this is the right interpretation, because first of all, I believe that especially the Roman legionnaires during the Spanish campaign of Scipio were already a bit more homogeneous between the various specialties. I mean, they obviously would retain from an administratively point of view the name of Astati, Principes, and Triari, but they would be equipped basically in the same fashion. I mean, what you find is the average Roman legionnaire with a coat of mail and a metal helm and a scutum and a gladius, and then fighting like that. So basically the Principes, that would be basically the model even for the Marian legionnaire. There would be practically the same thing, aside from maybe a certain different evolution of the armor that had, telling the truth, not much to do with this specialization, but this idea that the standard troop that you can use, especially if you have a cohort, so men that seem to be a unique body in this sense, and that can even switch, because when the cohorts here changed, they turned. I mean, in this sense, they were exposing their own flanks in the sense that the column that was marching was made up of the guys from the flank in the front. So these were guys that supposedly had to be from the lower ranks. It is true that lower ranks in this sense from the manipular system would be the heavier ones, because the first lines were made up of the more lightly astati, armored astati, and then the others. But the idea to me is that at the time of Scipio in Spain, the cohortal system was practically achievable, also because the legionnaires were increasingly grown to be practically homogeneous from an equipment point of view, and the lightly armed troops that are mentioned in the sources in this sense could be a kind of more of a specialization, maybe of other extra skirmishers, or I don't know what, or maybe assault troops. In this sense, they were named because they were fighting against the elephants, so maybe they needed more troops, more light troops to harass the elephants, because maybe with the Iberians it was already easy with a few guys to cut them to pieces. I don't know, these are all speculations, but they're still interesting to discuss. Unfortunately, we will never know as much as we would like about these topics. But this was the Battle of Ilipa, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel. And for now, I thank you heartily, as always, for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye!